So, good afternoon. My name is Deb Watson-Hammond. I am the Literature Chair and the Co-Director for Programs of the 19th Century Club. 19th Century Charitable Association, the building that we are in is our historic building, the 19th Century Club. Our mission statement is strengthening our community through learning, giving, and sharing our landmark building. So we're very happy to see everyone here, and we're going to be talking about something that most of us have heard about. If we attended high school, we heard it in the high school. If we're in the community, we drive by these buildings all the time and hear about the history of Ernest Hemingway, Edgar Rice Burroughs, and of course Frank Lloyd Wright. Nancy Sindelar has a Ph.D. and has made many, many popular presentations about the life and work of Ernest Hemingway. I could go on, but then I would deprive you of hearing what she has to say. But she presented for 3 different years at the International Colloquium Ernest Hemingway in Havana, Cuba. She spoke 3 years at the American Literature Association conferences, spoke at the Hemingway Society conferences in Venice, Italy, and Oak Park, and twice keynoted the Hemingway Festival in Sun Valley, Idaho. In addition to these and many, many, many more presentations nationally and worldwide, she guides a walking tour of young Hemingway's Oak Park. She's a board member of the Ernest Hemingway Foundation of Oak Park and teaches Hemingway, the man, the writer, the legend at the University of California, Riverside. Her presentations display her passion for all things Hemingway, her research into his private letters, his fiction, his nonfiction, her extensive travel all over the world to get knowledge of the locales that were important to the writer, and that's what we're going to focus on today, how place had an impact on him, on his personality, and on his writing. She has stood in the bedroom where Hemingway was born and in the foyer where he ended his life, and has visited all of the places in between. And we all know Ernest was a traveler. He did not stay put. So I'm very pleased to present Nancy Sindelar to talk about Ernest Hemingway.
Well, thank you, Deb, and it is really a pleasure to be here today because, as probably you know, Ernest's mother, Grace Hall Hemingway, was a member of the 19th Century Women's Club. So I'm really going to be talking about her little boy, Ernie, who started out right here, just a block east on Oak Park Avenue. And he had an amazing life, and he started out here, and I believe he really got a strong education, a strong Midwestern work ethic, and a sense of adventure that all started right here in Oak Park. So it's very exciting to be back here in Oak Park and to be with all of you today. So Ernest was born in Oak Park in July of 1899, but he really became a citizen of the world. And as you can see from the chronology, you know, he was in Oak Park, and then he moved on to Italy, went up to Canada, to Toronto, spent time in Europe, starting out with World War I, went down to Key West, went back to Spain for the Spanish Civil War, and then spent 22 years in Cuba, and then ended his life in Idaho, in Sun Valley, actually, in Ketchum. So when you look at his life, it really is a series of concentric circles where he just keeps moving on and on and on. And I think that one of the reasons he moved around so much is that he was looking for new material to write about. So he moved around a lot, he wrote a lot of great literature, and frequently as he moved, he was also with a new woman. So I'm going to be talking about that aspect of his life too. So the early years, this is a picture of Ernest. He was the second of 6 children, And so he's there, he's about 6 months old there, and he's with Marceline, his older sister, who was 18 months older than he was. And you probably know that the mother raised them as twins. She held Marceline back in school, and so they went through school together. And if you look at the high school yearbook, you'll see that they both graduated from Oak Park River Forest High School the same year, but she actually was older than he was. One of the benefits of their going through school together is that they became really good friends, and they had common friends. So they would write to each other, and there's a lot of information that comes about Ernest's personal life just through the letters that he shares with his older sister, Marceline. Here's the family with the first four of the 6 children. And so you see Grace, who was a musician and trained as an opera singer. She had planned to be an opera singer in New York, but the lights on the stage bothered her eyes, so she returned to Oak Park and married Dr. Clarence Hemingway, who actually lived across the street from the house where Grace grew up. So this is a house that you'll recognize. It's just about a block away on Oak Park Avenue, and this was Ernest's birthplace home. He was born, as I said, there on July 21st in 1899. And his father was an obstetrician. He actually was head of obstetrics at Oak Park Hospital, and he was there at Ernest's birth. And all of his siblings were born at home. Not all of them were born in this house, but back in the day, that's where babies were born. So the house is very typical of the homes that were along Oak Park Avenue. And as you probably know, Oak Park started on Lake Street. So the oldest homes in Oak Park are the ones that are the closest to Lake Street. And it's a lovely home. It's now a museum. And I hope you'll come over and take a tour because it's restored to the way it was when Ernest lived there. This is the interior of the home, and what's interesting about this slide is that Ernest's parents had very high expectations for their children. They expected their kids to be doing something worthwhile all the time. And so on the right side of the slide is the parlor, and Grace, who loved music, had a family orchestra, and each child played a musical instrument. Ernest played the cello. And on the left side of the slide is the library, and that library contained all Shakespeare's works, the works of Dickens, the works of Thackeray, and the kids were expected to be reading, doing something purposeful. And one of the details that comes out in the letters between Marceline and Ernest is she recalls when they were home from school reading the mumps, or having the mumps, and they read all of Shakespeare's tragedies during that time. So these parents with high expectations really gave Ernest a very strong work ethic that lasted him throughout his life. And he kind of has this reputation as a womanizer and drinking a lot and partying a lot, but he really worked very hard. He always wrote early in the morning, and then he'd play in the afternoon, but he was very serious about his work ethic. The other thing is that, so he has the benefit of being in Oak Park during the school year, and the benefit of going to Oliver Wendell Holmes School, Oak Park River Forest High School. And then in the summer, the family went up to Walloon Lake. And this is where he learned to hunt and to fish and develop his love of the outdoors, which definitely comes out in all of his literary works. Whenever a character needs to find solace, needs to kind of get their head together, they go fishing, or they go up in the mountains, or there's some place where they can enjoy the peace of nature. And that was very important to Ernest Hemingway, and that starts out here in this cottage at Walloon Lake. This is the interior of the cottage. And another important part from Oak Park is the library. And Ernest would take books up to Walloon Lake in the summer and just read voraciously. Sometimes he would just stay in the tent because the cottage only had 2 rooms, but he would read with a kerosene lantern, and that's how he would spend his evenings. Here they are with their feet in Walloon Lake, and Dr. Hemingway was also loved up in that region because at the time there was a large lumbering industry going on in Michigan, and the cottage was surrounded with Indian camps, and the Indians were used, the Native Americans were used as laborers for cutting down the trees and were very key to this logging industry. But if there was an injury, Dr. Hemingway would go over and he would do pro bono medical work. So Ernest is very much affected by the experiences of his doctor father. And if you read the short stories, if you read the novels, you'll see there are a lot of references to medical situations. So one of his famous short stories is Indian Camp, where there is a woman, she's been in labor for 2 days, she's having a breech birth, and the doctor, with his son, goes over to the Indian camp and delivers this woman via cesarean section. He cuts her open with a jackknife and sews her up with fishing twine. So Ernest also gets his sense of adventure from his father. So that one of the things that the father did, in addition to being a doctor, was he was very interested in photography. So lucky for all of us who have an interest in Ernest Hemingway, there are a lot of pictures available to him of him because he is the son of a photographer. The father also liked to hunt and to fish, and this is how Ernest learned to hunt and fish. And his sense of adventure, too, comes from the father. So here they are. This is the family boat. And Dr. Clarence Hemingway would load the kids in that boat. He'd take it out in the middle of the lake. He'd rock the boat until it capsized, and he'd tell the kids, okay, swim to shore. And, you know, I've talked to audiences and people will say, oh, that's child abuse. Not for the Hemingway kids. They loved it. They loved the competitions. And of course, when they get to high school, they're on the high school swimming team. So this was a family that really had high expectations and this sense of adventure and this sense of doing something. And, you know, I've spent a lot of time reading about Ernest Hemingway's parents and his grandparents, and it just reinforces to me how important and how influential we all are as parents and grandparents. You maybe think it doesn't matter, but when you read the life of Ernest Hemingway, you realize his parents and his grandparents were incredibly important in making the man that he actually turned out to be. So here is Grace Hall Hemingway. Well, today she's fishing. She's not at the 19th Century Women's Club, but she's out in Michigan catching a fish. And so when you think back in the day, so Ernest is there, he's about 6 years old. So this is about 1905. Grace caught that fish. And she embraced that outdoor life, which, you know, there's a lot of stuff about Grace Hemingway that he didn't like his mother and that she was too tough on the family. I have a lot of respect for her. She took her 6 children up to this 2-room cabin every summer. Ernest went up there from the time he was 6 months old until he was 18 years old. And because of her willingness to do this, he really learned a lot about nature. He learned to hunt, he learned to fish, and he learned to love the outdoors. So if you look closely at that picture, you see Ernest is with his sister, and he's dressed as a little Indian. I mean, now we say Native American, and today we say indigenous people, and I'm not being disrespectful. It's just that the Hemingway writing and everything and that you read about him does refer to him as an Indian. And you can see he's got fringe on his pants, and he's dressed as an American Indian. So this is a game farm that was close to Oak Park, and so Dr. Hemingway, who was a really good shot, a good marksman, the Indians called him Eagle Eye, taught Ernest to hunt and to target practice. So Ernest is about 10 years old in that picture, and it's at a game farm near Oak Park. So now we go to the grandparents. When you think about the literature of Ernest Hemingway, he's fascinated with war. So he grows up in kind of a Victorian environment in Oak Park, very religious family. The family were members of a Congregational church on Lake Street. And Grace was very involved with the choir. Ernest's father was very involved with the men in the church. And Ernest and his siblings all had to read the Bible and pass a test on the Bible. So it's a very religious family that thinks, well, you know, God's going to save us. And then Ernest goes off to World War I, and he realizes that World War I is a bloodbath. And there's a shift in his values because he sees that modern warfare is not as honorable and courageous as his grandfathers had told him it was. So in this photo, you see his paternal grandfather, Anson Hemingway. The photo's 1915, and Anson has just marched in the Oak Park Memorial Day parade. And if you look at the photo, you can see he's wearing his Civil War hat and his Civil War medals. So the Civil War is long over, but the grandfather is still very proud of his involvement with the Civil War. And he was the one that really coached Ernest into believing that war was how men show courage and honor. And so throughout Ernest's life, he's very involved with war. He goes off as an ambulance driver in World War I. He's involved in the Spanish Civil War, and he's a reporter for the North American News Alliance in World War II. And as Ernest's literature grows, he just becomes fascinated with men in a life-threatening situation. And the theme, really, of all of his books is how men face death. And he believes that you should face death with grace under pressure. And once you understand that, it's almost a formula for all of his writing. This is the bedroom of Abba Ernest Hall, his maternal grandfather. And his maternal grandfather actually died in the house on Oak Park Avenue when Ernest was about 5 or 6 years old. And as was the custom in that day, he was waked in the parlor. So at a very young age, Ernest sees his grandfather lying in state in the parlor. So he has an initiation with war and death at a very early age, and those become very important themes in his writing. So after her father dies, after Grace's father dies, she takes her inheritance. She'd been living in that house on Oak Park Avenue since she was 15 years old, and she's like, I want something new. So she builds the house on Kenilworth Avenue. And it wasn't designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, but you can see some of the Wrightian influences in that it has the broad overhanging eaves, it has the horizontal banding, instead of being clappered and shingled, it has stucco. And so it has a different look than the original house that she was living in. Now the house is still there, and one part that's missing that was part of the original house is that on the north side of the house there was a huge music room. And so Grace was very involved with holding concerts and doing some teaching in the music room. But that room didn't have a basement to it, and it just didn't hold up very well, so that's no longer there. But Ernest lived in this house until he was 18 years old. And here he is with Adelaide Hemingway, his paternal grandmother, and his mother and his sister on the steps of that house. The high school, well, if there's ever an advertisement for American public education, it's Ernest Hemingway at Oak Park River Forest High School. His parents had these expectations that he be involved, and that school, as it is today, had all these opportunities for him to try things out, and he did. So he was on the swimming team. He's in the first row on the right side. And of course, given all of his swimming experiences on Wallen Lake, of course he's on the swimming team. And, so here he is up close. He's in the rifle club. Of course, he loves to hunt and fish. Now, they don't have that club anymore, but of course he would be in that. The school play, Oak Park River Forest High School, has had this long tradition of the school musicals. And, if every child has an opportunity to participate at some level in those Oak Park musicals. And of course, Ernest did too. So in this case, it's the play Beau Brummel, and he's center stage with that white wig. That's our friend Ernest Hemingway. But had he not been on stage, he would have been in the pit orchestra playing the cello, because he was in the orchestra too. So this is the page from his high school yearbook. So you see him graduating at the same time as his older sister. And if you look at the entries of that yearbook, look at the number of activities that the Hemingway kids are in versus the other two kids. It's like, they were involved in everything. And so his parents very much wanted him to go to college. And the yearbook says he's going to go to the University of Illinois. But what he really wanted to do was go out and get a job. So his senior year in high school, he took journalism. And he had a teacher by the name of Fanny Biggs who ran that journalism class like a newspaper office. Somebody was the editor, somebody wrote the sports, somebody did the advertising. And senior year, Ernest was editor of the newspaper. And so instead of going to the University of Illinois, like it says in his yearbook, he goes off to Kansas City and gets a job as a cub reporter for the Kansas City Star. And so we all know Ernest's reputation as a great novelist and a great short story writer. But when things got a little thin or he needed more action, he was a journalist in and out through his entire life. Now, before he even left high school, he published 3 short stories in the school literary magazine, which was called The Tabula. And then he also was editor of the newspaper, which was The Trapeze, and it's still called The Trapeze. And so I taught at the high school for a while, and I've had the opportunity to read some of his high school papers. And there's no question, he writes like a 16-year-old, but you still see the themes of his love of the outdoors, and the content for his papers frequently come from his summer experiences in Michigan. Okay, so here's another adventure. Dr. Hemingway had one of the first cars in Oak Park. And so they have this Model T. And the year that Ernest graduated from high school, Dr. Hemingway decides they're going to drive from Oak Park up to northern Michigan in this car. So Ernest goes, Clarence, the father, goes, Grace, the mother, goes, and Lester, the youngest child, goes in this car. Now, this is before the days of really paved roads, gas stations, motels, and it's a long drive today if you take the superhighway. It took them 5 days and 4 nights. They slept on the road in tents at night, and they had an axe in the back of the car so that Ernest could chop down branches from trees because they were afraid that the car was going to get stuck in the very sandy soil of Michigan. So when they arrive up in Michigan in the car, I mean, all these people weren't in the car. It was just the 4 of them. But, of course, you know, the cousins and the neighbors all show up. But I love that picture because if you look closely, Ernest is wearing his Oak Park High School letter sweater. And he's got that look of, you know, you all have had kids that graduated from high school, and you know their attitude the summer after they graduate from high school. It's like, I'm so cool, and, you know, don't tell me what to do. I just finished high school. And he's got that look on his face. I mean, he's just like, all right. And he was that way. It was a tough summer. His parents wanted him to do chores up in Walloon Lake, and he kind of didn't want to do it. And they wanted him to go to college, and he didn't want to go to college. And so, I mean, it's some of these patterns that we've all experienced as parents and grandparents. But I just think you can just see it in that kind of slouchy, know-it-all look on him. So again, this is about that same summer, and he's caught a big fish. But then he gets a job at the Kansas City Star as a cub reporter. So as I said, his life is a series of concentric circles. So his world now has expanded beyond Oak Park. And that's what he does. He loves that interest of moving on in life. And he does that really until the day he dies. So he goes to Kansas City. He's befriended by some older reporters. He loves to hang out at the police station and at the general hospital because he likes to get stories about action. The other thing that's very important is all the reporters had to follow the Kansas City Style Manual, which was very strict about not using slang, not using a lot of adjectives, not using a lot of adverbs, very exact, simplistic, stark writing. And that was what made Ernest Hemingway's style really revolutionary, is that he didn't use a lot of flowery or a lot of descriptive language. Well, he really wanted to get involved in World War I when he finished high school, and he was not allowed to enlist because of his eyesight, and his parents also weren't too excited about that fact. So when the American Red Cross came through Kansas City looking for ambulance drivers, he jumped at the chance. So he comes back to Oak Park. He goes and he sees his journalism teacher, Miss Biggs, and he says, now, if something happens to me, I want you to write the obituary because I know you won't put a lot of fluff in it. And then he goes off to Italy, and here he is as an ambulance driver in Italy. And his role was to take supplies down to Italian soldiers who were in trenches. So this becomes a huge turning point in his outlook on life, because World War I was the first modern warfare where people were being hit with shells, mustard gas was being used, there were some airplanes, and it was different from what his grandfathers had told him. And so he tries to figure out from this point on, how does a man show honor and courage in the modern world? So this whole experience, all of his novels are very experiential. So this whole experience becomes the content for A Farewell to Arms. So here you see the soldiers, the Italian soldiers at Fossalta di Piave in World War I. So Fossalta is the name of the town, Piave is the river, and that's where Ernest was stationed. He is taking supplies to soldiers in the trenches, and as he's in the trench with these Italian soldiers, and they're hit with an Austrian shell. One Italian soldier was killed immediately, another had his legs blown off, and Ernest put the third on his back and was trying to run to safety, and he was hit in the back of his legs with machine gun fire. So he winds up in the hospital, in the American Red Cross hospital, eventually in Milan. Well, guess what happens? So, people have kind of figured out, did Ernest have a girlfriend in high school? The answer kind of is no. Grace would let him go to the dances, but he had to take his sister. Then he's in this hospital, and he sees this American nurse. And frankly, she's 8 years older than he is, but he falls in love with her. And this is Agnes von Kurowski, who becomes the model, actually, for Catherine Barclay in A Farewell to Arms. Now, it's very dangerous to be Ernest Hemingway's friend because you show up in one of his books. And Catherine Barclay in A Farewell to Arms is this nurse that jumps into bed with this soldier, and she winds up getting pregnant, and there's a birth scene at the end of the novel. And everyone knows that Catherine Barclay is modeled after Agnes von Kurowski. But Agnes spends the rest of her life saying, no, nothing happened. I was his nurse, and so it's really interesting how he takes real life situations, but he puts a little spin on them. So here he is. This is in Milan, and he really was seriously injured. He almost lost a leg. But he survives, and he has both legs, and he's outside there with his crutches, still in Italy. And then after the war, he comes back to Oak Park. So there he is, standing outside the Kenilworth Avenue house. But it's kind of a sad time for him because all of his friends from high school are off in college. And he gets this letter from Agnes saying that she's not going to marry him, and she's actually going to marry somebody else. So not only are his friends gone, he is heartbroken because the woman that he thought he loved and she loved him didn't turn out to be that way. So what does he do? He goes to the library in Petoskey, which is very close to where the summer cottage is, and he gives a talk about World War I, and he meets a woman, Harriet Conable, who asks him to be the companion to her son in Toronto. And the son is disabled, and Ernest decides, well, he has nothing else to do that winter, so he goes up to Toronto. And Mr. Conable has friends at the Toronto Star, so Ernest also gets the opportunity to write a few articles for the Toronto Star. He does that. He comes back to Chicago, and through a mutual friend, he meets Hadley Richardson, who is from St. Louis, but visiting friends in Chicago. And she, too, is older than Ernest. But they get married, and their wedding actually is up in northern Michigan at Horton Bay. So Hadley is wife number one. She is the one, if you've read The Paris Wife, this is Hadley Richardson Hemingway, who becomes the Paris wife. They are living on Dearborn in Chicago in this apartment building, and he gets a letter from the Toronto Star. Would you like to be our foreign correspondent? Would you like to go to Paris? Well, he says, yeah, and she's very supportive of whatever he wants to do. And so he quits his job, and they move to Paris. They live in a 4th floor walk-up. So as Deb said, I've been to all of his houses. So I've been to this place. And it's in a working class neighborhood. It's kind of run down. It was sort of run down when they were there. It was 2 rooms. The toilet is a Turkish toilet in the hallway. There's no running water, and there's no central heat. The heat was just a fireplace. It's on the 4th floor. You walk up 4 sets of spiral stairs. And he writes back to his parents. Again, it's really fascinating to read his letters. He tells his parents, who of course are living in Oak Park, they're still on Kenilworth Avenue. He says, "This is the jolliest place you've ever seen." And this is the neighborhood. And in the winter, they go skiing. He thought that Paris was kind of damp in the winter. So he's writing for the Toronto Star, and he learns to ski in Switzerland. And in this case, they've made this homemade bobsled run. So that's Ernest. He's the last person on the bobsled. And of course now, if you watch the Olympics, they're all wearing helmets and everything, but not Ernest Hemingway. He just goes on. None of them had helmets. But that snow there is concave. And so he writes back to the Toronto Star, "A thrill that starts in the base of your spine and in a shiver." And then, so Hadley and Ernest move to Paris, and she becomes pregnant. They move back briefly to Toronto. And after living in Paris for a while, they hate Toronto. And he quits his job, and they come back to Paris. But now he has severed his connection with the Toronto Star. So they really are living on a shoestring, and they are living above a sawmill. And he's trying to write, she's trying to play the piano, they have a baby, the sawmill's going on. And this is, when I say Ernest Hemingway had a strong work ethic, this is when he really needed it, because a lot of people would have just given up and said, "Forget this, I'm going to just get a day job." And he stayed with his writing. So here's Hadley and Ernest and their baby. They called him Bumby. The godmother was Gertrude Stein. So, being Oak Parkers, I can tell you this. The parents were strict Congregationalists. The grandparents were educated at Wheaton College. And Gertrude Stein is Jewish, and she's also a lesbian. But Ernest writes back to his parents saying, "Don't worry about Bumby's religious education. He has an absolutely wonderful grandmother, or godmother." So they go skiing in Austria, and they take the baby with them. So this is a very rich time in his life, where they're really having a wonderful time in Europe and lots of great experiences. Ernest meets a man named Robert McElmon, who introduces Ernest to the bullfight, and they go to Spain. And one of the things about the bullfight that was so fascinating to Ernest is, like war, he's able to study how men face death and how men face dangerous situations. So he really becomes an expert on the bullfight, and he ultimately writes a book called Death in the Afternoon, which is, sort of the definitive book on bullfighting. Now, what's interesting about this picture is that at this time, a woman by the name of Pauline Pfeiffer also comes to Paris, and she's there to cover fashion shows for Vogue magazine. She's from a very wealthy family. She spent a lot of time in St. Louis. And she's kind of got her eye on Ernest Hemingway. And in A Movable Feast, Ernest makes the point that Pauline uses the oldest trick known to man. You know what that is? Pauline befriends Hadley. But she's really got her eye on Hadley's husband. And she gets her way. So Ernest and Pauline wind up having an affair, and then Hadley sues for divorce. Hadley does get all the royalties from Sun Also Rises, so she comes out of it kind of okay financially. But so Ernest and Pauline are married, and they move here. So, I mean, it's definitely a step up financially for Ernest. Pauline's family is very wealthy. They own Warner Pharmaceuticals and Richard Hudnut Cosmetics. And so Pauline has a pipeline to money. After a while, they decide to leave Paris, and they go to Key West. John Dos Passos was the one who encouraged Ernest to go to Key West. Originally, they weren't going to stay there that long, but they wind up living there for 12 years. Pauline, who also has an uncle that just dotes on her, so he buys them this house. And Pauline moves her antiques from Paris to Key West. The bed is from the headboard is from the gate of a Spanish monastery. And Ernest has a study. If you've been in the house in Key West, his study is above it's a garage now, but it was a carriage house. He gets a boat, and of course he loves to fish, so that hobby that he learned on Walloon Lake it gets expanded, and he fishes in the Gulf Stream and gets these huge fish. I mean, 400-pound marlin and tarpon, and he's just loving this. So, you know, in Walloon Lake, the fish were this big, and now they're this big. So he's fascinated with the bullfight, and so he goes back to Spain and studies the bullfight. So there you can see that picture of Ernest and Pauline, and you see the intense look on his face and how fascinated he is with watching the details of the matador and the actions of the bull and the reaction of the matador. Uncle Gus also finances a safari to Africa. Back then, this was in 1933, it was $25,000. And Ernest does some interesting things to prepare for the safari. He studies the actions of lions and tigers with circus leaders, and he buys this high-powered gun. And he's just thrilled with the opportunity of being able to go back and hunt in Africa. So he's getting these huge trophies. All right, so he comes back to Key West. He's written now Sun Also Rises, A Farewell to Arms. He's started on To Have and To Have Not. And he really has kind of a nice life. I mean, his wife is pretty much paying the bills. He doesn't have to worry about supporting his wife and his children. He can write in the morning and go fishing in the afternoon. And he just gets kind of bored with it all. And the novels are not as successful as the ones that involved war. For example, Farewell to Arms. So he goes to Spain to get involved in the Spanish Civil War. And he gets a job, much to Pauline's dismay, as a reporter for the North American Newspaper Alliance. The other aspect of this is that while he was in Key West, he met Martha Gellhorn, who's 28 years old, blonde, very interested in the Spanish Civil War. And the two of them decide to go to Spain to cover the Spanish Civil War together. Now, Ernest is still married to Pauline, but it's very clear that he is having a very close relationship with Martha Gellhorn, who actually becomes wife number 3. So they get married in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and then they go to China. Now, unlike Hadley and Pauline, Martha has a career. She is a writer for Collier's magazine and is very focused on her career. So their relationship, they got along fine in Spain when they were both covering the war, but when they're actually married, they have a very competitive relationship. And she's not really all that interested in being Mrs. Hemingway because she's trying to establish herself as a writer. So they go to China. Martha's the one that has the job, and Ernest gets a sort of an assignment for PM magazine. And after they get back from Spain, it's Martha Gellhorn who discovers the finca in Cuba. And so they get married, they live in the finca. And this is the living room of the finca. I know that some of you have been there. And it's filled with animal trophies. So it's interesting to read about his marriages. So he and Martha were fine in Spain when they were surrounded with bombs and all these terrible things going on during the Spanish Civil War. But when they're actually married and living in this beautiful house, they bicker over nonsense. So she does not like these animal trophies in the house. She thinks they're unsanitary. And of course, he's very proud of them. They have a swimming pool. He likes to invite his buddies over from fishing and from the harbor. And like, yeah, come on, let's have a drink, let's go for a swim. And she wants them all to take a shower first. So, I mean, he's kind of a slob, and she's sort of a neatnik, and they just have this conflict. So Ernest, at this point, has 3 children. He had John with Hadley, and then he had 2 more boys with Pauline. And the boys come to Cuba, and he teaches them. He's a father very much like his father was. He teaches his kids to hunt and to fish, and he wants them to have a good education. So these are, the older boy in the chair is John, or Bumby. This is the dining room in Cuba. And this is his study. There are over 4,000 books in the finca, and right now the scholars are in the process of reading all of his notes in the margins of these books and annotating his thoughts about each of these books. This is the bathroom, and I took this picture because at the end of his life, Ernest became sort of a hypochondriac. And so if you look on the wall by the scale, he'd weigh himself every morning, and he'd write his weight and his blood pressure on the wall. And you see the briefcase there and the bookcase? The toilet is in front of it. So, I mean, I made the point earlier that Ernest really liked to read. He read all the time. And like grandfather Anson Hemingway, Ernest kept his uniforms. So, you know, we see Anson Hemingway marching in the Oak Park Parade in 1915 in his Civil War uniform. Ernest's ambulance uniform is in the museum in Key West, and his North American Newspaper Alliance reporter uniform is in the house in Key West. So he was very proud of his involvement with these wars and with his uniforms. And so that's just kind of a family trait. So, I mean, it's been wonderful to write this book and say, hey, I'm writing a book on Ernest Hemingway. Can I please go in his closet? You know, it's just... one of his wives, so wife number 4, Mary Hemingway, built this tower at the finca. And this is a picture in the tower where she wanted him to write, but he really never wrote that much in the tower. But in the tower is this typewriter. So this is like a 1923, 1924 portable typewriter. And this is the typewriter on which he wrote Sun Also Rises. And so he would type his manuscripts and then edit them by hand. So it's fascinating to see how he could, you know, write these great novels on such really primitive equipment. So he's in Cuba with Martha Gellhorn, and she is a writer for Collier's, and she goes over to Europe at the start of World War II, and she's writing letters to him saying, you got to come over to Europe. This is where all the action is. And so after a little prodding by Martha, he goes over and decides to cover World War II. Well, Collier's fires Martha and hires him because men were authorized to go into war zones and women weren't. So, you know, they didn't have such a great marriage at this point, but this was the final nail in the coffin of their marriage because she was so angry. And so this is where she finally leaves. I mean, he winds up divorcing her. So she's out of the scene, and shortly after that, he meets wife number 4, Mary Welsh, who's a reporter for Time magazine, and they actually meet in London during World War II. Mary is married to someone else, but she finds out that during the liberation of Paris, Ernest is checking in at the Ritz Hotel, and guess who shows up at the Ritz Hotel but Mary Hemingway? And they two eventually get married, and they split their time between Cuba and Sun Valley, Idaho. So, I mean, Ernest, like in Oak Park, where the family would spend the school year in Oak Park and the summers in Michigan, throughout his entire life, he was always doing this two-home routine. And frequently, it was a home where he could hunt and fish during part of the year and write. And it was always locations that were friendly to hunting and fishing. So here they are outside the Sun Valley Lodge. They take a trip to Venice because, of course, he loved Italy and wanted to go back to Italy as often as possible. So they're on the deck of the Gritty Palace looking over the Grand Canal. And, you know, the pictures of Hemingway and his wives tell a lot. And if you look at that picture, you can see that, you know, maybe things aren't so terrific right now. And they go to Venice, and he goes duck hunting with some Venetian aristocrats. And during one of these trips, he becomes infatuated with one of the daughters of the aristocrats. And she's 19 years old, and he's 49. So he says, oh, she's my muse. You know, I write better when she's around. And he actually invites her to Cuba. And so this picture was taken at the Floridita in Cuba. And, you know, look at the expressions on these people's faces. I mean, he's looking at Adriana Ivanisic, who says, you know, in letters and things, well, I appreciated his attention. We were friends. He says things like, well, I would ask you to marry me, but I know you'd say no. Now, Mary Hemingway is the blonde in the middle of the picture, and sitting on Mary's right is Adriana's mother, who has come along as a chaperone. So, I mean, all of these people are like, what's going on? This, you know, relationship is very strange. So Adriana is immortalized. Again, it's dangerous to be Ernest Hemingway's friend. Adriana winds up in a book called Across the River and Into the Trees, where this young Italian aristocratic girl has a torrid affair with an American colonel. And I actually heard Adriana's brother speak at a conference in Italy, and he too is defending her virtue, saying, no, 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 nothing happened with our Adriana. She was a good girl. And, you know, Ernest is just sort of fantasizing about what a relationship with an 18, 19-year-old girl would be like in Across the River and Into the Trees. The book was banned in Venice for a while because the parents were so horrified by it. And it's not one of his great novels, but the backstory is pretty interesting. Mary, unlike the other wives, just kind of looks the other way. And so they go back to Cuba. They decide to go back to Africa. At this point, he's sort of trying to relive his past, and he wants to go on another safari. So they do go back to Africa on a safari, but they're in 2 plane crashes. And this is sort of the beginning of his physical decline. He has several concussions from these plane crashes. They survived the first plane crash by camping out near an alligator-infested river, and then they jump on a boat the next day. They get on another plane, and that plane crashes. But they survive that. They go back to Cuba. And so, as I said, Across the River and Into the Trees was not a successful book, and Ernest decides he needs to sort of get back his reputation as a great American writer, and so he writes Old Man and the Sea, which of course is one of his greatest books. And the book, like some of the others, was made into a movie. So again, here we are at the Floridita, and there's Ernest, and the man to his left is Spencer Tracy, who plays the old man in the film Old Man and the Sea. So Ernest was never really happy with any of the movie versions of his books, but he did like the money that came from them, so he took that. He was very much loved by the Cuban fishermen, and when he died, the Cuban fishermen melted the propellers and the anchors from their boats, and they made this statue, this bust of Hemingway. And this is at Cojimar in Cuba. And, the one thing about Hemingway's life is he had this amazing range of friends. So most of his books were made into films, so he knows Ava Gardner, he knows Ingrid Bergman, he knows Barbara Stanwyck, he knows Gary Cooper, but he also is honored by the simplest of Cuban fishermen who adored him. And he just had this gift for engaging with people, telling stories, being interested in what they're interested in. And so he really had a very broad range of friends. So here he is with Martha Gellhorn. After the Cuban Revolution in 1959, he decided he needed to buy a house in Ketchum, which is the town next to Sun Valley. They had been going there as tourists for a long time. So here he is with Martha, and then later on with Mary. And there he is with Patrick. Patrick is the only child that is still alive. He lives in Bozeman, Montana. And again, hunting in Idaho was very important. And one of the reasons he became friends with Gary Cooper, who's also in that picture, is that Gary Cooper was also in Sun Valley and liked to hunt. And Gary Cooper was also in one of the movies. He played the role of Robert Jordan in For Whom the Bell Tolls. So they were very, very good friends. This is in the Sun Valley Lodge, and you see Gary Cooper is there with his wife, Rocky, and they're all dressed in their sort of Austrian boiled wool jackets. And he's schmoozing Gary Cooper's wife. I mean, he just can't help himself. This is the house in Ketchum. And this is the house where he ended his life. So at the end, partly because of all these concussions, there's a lot of research that's been done on the cause of his depression and the cause of these brain injuries. But the family suffered from depression. Clarence Hemingway ended his life in the house on Kenilworth Avenue. And Ernest ends his life in Ketchum, Idaho. He's suffering from depression. Mary takes him to the Mayo Clinic where he undergoes electric shock therapy. and the electric shock therapy erases his memory. And that is absolutely a critical element in his downfall, because Ernest wrote from his experiences. His writings are all experiential. I mean, he embellished them a little bit, but still they are based on his memory. And when he couldn't write, when he couldn't remember anymore, that really put a damper on his writing and increased his depression. So he kept his guns in this house because he hunted a lot. And this is the living room of the house. And you can see he's like 60, 61 years old in that picture. And he just doesn't have the same virility that he had maybe 5, 10 years earlier. His guns were in the lower level of his house. So when I was there, I retraced his footsteps. So the evening of July 1st, 1961, he takes Mary out to dinner. They have come back to Ketchum from the Mayo Clinic. Ernest has convinced his doctors that he's fine, that he'll take his medicine, that he won't be depressed anymore, and he'll be just fine. But the truth was, he was planning on ending his life. So he takes Mary out to dinner, and then the next morning he gets up very early. She's sleeping on the 3rd level of the house, and he goes down into the lower level and he picks up his gun. He walks through the living room and into the vestibule of the house. And he puts the butt of the gun on the floor, the barrel of the gun to his forehead, and he puts his toe in the trigger, and he presses the trigger. This is his grave. He's buried in Idaho in the Ketchum Cemetery. Now Mary is next to him. Bumby is there too. And one of his granddaughters, Margot Hemingway, is there. And it's a very simple cemetery. You know, if you know where it is, you just drive down the highway and walk into it. But he couldn't write anymore, and so he wanted to end his life. And, you know, he said, there's a quote that he said that once writing is your greatest pleasure, only death can stop it. And I really believe that writing was his greatest pleasure, even though he's renowned for other things. He really was an excellent writer, and that was very important to him. Also very important to him was this town. He got a great education here, work ethic, and those values never left him. So thank you.
I noticed you never mentioned anything about his drinking or alcoholism. Why?
Well, when he was in Oak Park, he didn't drink. You know, one of the things that I didn't mention about Clarence Hemingway was, given his congregational and strict Protestant background, there was no drinking, no smoking, no card playing, no gambling, no dancing in the Hemingway house. But then as Hemingway moved on, and certainly during the time in Europe, you know, he started to drink wine and other forms of alcohol. The years in Cuba, he drank. I think part of his decline was not only alcohol, but also self-medicating for depression, because he was taking drugs for depression. And so the alcohol is a depressant, and the drugs were sort of, he just got kind of messed up medically. But yeah, he had a good time. And I must say that I spent the winter of 2021 living in that house in Ketchum. And my point was to meet some of the people that still remembered him. And they'd love to go out and hunt, and they'd shoot ducks and pheasants, and they'd come back to that house. And Mary, who started out as a correspondent for Time magazine, gave up her career and became a good cook. And she would cook all of these things, and they'd have these great parties. So, I don't know that he was truly alcoholic. He just drank a lot. And what the difference is, I can't tell you. But yes, he did enjoy liquor. But it was with a group of friends, and certainly in the context of having a good time and a good meal. One more?
Nancy, what can you tell us about the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover surveilling him at the end of his life?
Well, when Ernest was in Cuba during World War II, there were submarines in the Caribbean, and Ernest, with his involvement with the war, wanted to attack these submarines. So at this time, Martha was in Europe, but Ernest turned his fishing boat, the Pilar, into a scientific, he disguised it as a scientific research vessel. And his plan was to have a submarine come up to the boat, and he was going to throw grenades down the conning tower. And he had his crew, they called him the Crook Factory, and his crew was going to kill off any of the Germans that came up on deck on the submarine. So the thing is, he had full support of the American ambassador from Cuba to do this. And but eventually the war ended, and he stopped this, and he went over to France and was involved with the D-Day invasion. So yes, this has been a very broad brush approach of the life of Ernest Hemingway, but there's more detail in the book if you're interested. But yes, he does have an FBI file. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.